Alright, I was originally going to make a video about the origin of glintstone and astrology, but Smotown already covered that in great detail and I don't really have anything to add to that anymore. So if you want to know all about that, check out his video, it's really good and goes into the details of glintstone. Link is in the description down below. Instead, for this video, I want to talk about and theorize a little about fate and astrology in the lands between, and how grace defies all of it. Now, all of this is speculation, but that's why it's fun. So ready your tinfoil hats and we'll begin. Well, actually, before we talk about any theories, let's talk about the astrologers in the lands between and how the stars tie into fate. The simplest explanation being that the beings in the lands between have a predetermined fate in their lives. Now, we don't know if this is true for all beings or only certain individuals the stars deem worthy, such as the Carian royal family. There is also this speculation that the stars themselves represent outer gods, and fate is them attempting to exert influence in the lands between. This belief started long before the age of the Erd Tree. It's even possible that this was the age of the primeval crucible, and while the whole mixing of traits and body parts were going on with the crucible, the astrologers were doing their own thing in regards to the stars and to fate. In the previous age, there was a place, not exactly a town, but just a place where astrologers used to reside in the mountaintops. Maybe even specifically the mountaintop of giants. The Sword of Night and Flame tells us that. It mentions astrologers who preceded the sorcerers established themselves in mountaintops that nearly touched the sky, and considered the fire giants their neighbors. The Sword of Night and Flame itself can channel the power of both sorcery, specifically primeval sorcery, and the flames of the fire giants, which in of itself is very interesting. This tells me that the astrologers weren't as bloodthirsty as the Golden Order when they first came about, and instead were more interested in learning about the stars, their fate, and even their neighbors. This pursuit of the stars would help the astrologers in learning about fate, and they would eventually come to a belief that their fate and even the fates of the gods were commanded by the stars. Take note of that wording as well, commanded by the stars. This will come into play later on. Eventually, the astrologers would discover the primeval current within the infinite cosmos of the universe, and it would rain down to the lands between like a sea of stars. This would become the foundation of glintstone. However, within that foundation, they would also find an abyss of darkness, an endless chasm of power beyond imagination. It would bewitch the likes of primeval sorcerers like Azure, but it would also make them fearful. Regardless, the primeval current would be the founding of glintstone sorcery, and the study of primeval power would bring about a new understanding of sorcery, fate, and what guides it. Using the primeval current as the basis, new sorceries would be made that, while not as powerful as the primeval current itself, it would appear a lot safer in terms of not needing to gaze into the abyss. It would also assist the sorcerers in studying about the stars and fate itself. It would be discovered that the moon, or maybe even moons, 3 moons, guide the stars, and mastery over the moon could lead to mastery over one's fate. This was a discovery made by the Nox, and they would study the Black Moon. Unfortunately, we don't know much else about what may have become of this discovery. However, it may be due to this Black Moon that they portend the coming of the Age of Stars and their Night Lord. While the Nox were portending the Black Moon, a new source of glintstone power was discovered by a young astrologer who gazed upon the stars. The young queen of Caria, Renala, would meet the full moon. This moon would teach her the fundamentals of full moon sorcery, and would portend her fate to become a queen. While the full moon and the dark moon would drive the sorceries of the Nox and the Carian royal family, the primeval sorcerers would fall into a bit of chaos with their discoveries. they would start cutting out their hearts. The glintstone blade tells us that the old sorcerers would slice open their hearts with these blades to imbue a primal glintstone with their soul, and thus did they die. But not exactly. Their soul would be moved into this primal glintstone, allowing them to move bodies as long as someone helps to move their primal glintstone to a new body. This, in my opinion, would give them a small sense of immortality and would basically kill their morality. They would view their experiments as nothing more than a step towards the height of sorcery, which would eventually allow them to turn even other sorcerers and sometimes even themselves into graven masses, in an attempt to become stars themselves and probably have control over their own fate. An act that would turn the sorcerers into a mass of heads, this which would eventually lead them to banning the teaching of the primeval current, and the primeval sorcerers would fall into hiding. This, in my opinion, would severely impact the advancement of glintstone sorceries, as the latest spells would be but a pale comparison of their primeval counterparts, until the arrival of the Carian royal family in Raya Lucaria. The mages of Raya Lucaria would be bewitched by the power of the full moon. The sorcery itself would swallow even the strongest sorceries and negate it. It would even weaken the magical resistance of those it strikes. Needless to say, the academy itself would be bewitched by its glow. Maybe also because the full moon could guide their fate. Eventually though, the Golden Order of Queen Marika would rise in Leyndell, with the power of the Elden Ring, which commanded the very stars themselves. I can only speculate, but I believe this means that those who were given grace weren't bound by their fate, which was written upon the stars, and instead, they would be able to change the very lands themselves by their actions. This would be evident as their champions would come to conquer most of the lands between, and they would even challenge Raya Lucaria. And though I believe their fate is not bound, with the newfound power of the sorcery of the Carian royals, which is the full moon sorcery, which may have the power to guide fate itself as well, is more than a match for the Golden Order. Even their minuscule troops and knights would be able to best the larger armies of the Golden Order. It would only be until Radagon himself challenged the full moon, and would fall for its beauty as well. The conflict would end at the marriage of Radagon of the Golden Order and Rennala of the Full Moon. Radagon and Rennala would bear children, and among their children, two would impact the very essence of glintstone and the belief of astrologers in fate. But they would still pale in comparison to the tarnished who controlled the very fate of the lands between. Now I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here. What happens next doesn't really have much to do with fate, at least not yet, but it's necessary context. I believe the children of Radagon and Rennala were fated for either the greatest of achievements or the most horrid of falls. Lunar Princess Rani was an Empyrean, and while led by her mother, would discover a third moon, a dark moon, one that was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. Triple moons reminds me of the triple goddesses, Hecate, Diana, you know. But I don't want to get into that. That's way too deep for me. But anyway, this would grant her power and influence within the Carian family. General Radahn would be hailed as one of the greatest demigods in the land. And Rykard, well, he achieved a lot in his life, up until his downfall to depravity. Either way, Rennala's children were all gifted and worthy of their achievements. However, after the exile of Godfrey the First Elden Lord, Radagon would leave Rennala and return to the Golden Order. He would also take his children with him to be of service to Queen Marika. They all had a seat in the throne of Leyndell. These seats would split their siblings as well though. Rani the Witch would come to despise her Empyrean flesh due to the control of the two fingers. Praetor Rykard would scheme against Leyndell and the Golden Order, and Starscourge Radahn would challenge the stars themselves and would lock it in place until his death. This would prevent the stars from acting upon the lands between, which would seal the fate of the Carian royal family and anyone whose fate was being altered by the stars. With their fates frozen, this prevented the Age of the Stars from coming along, and I believe this fate would eventually come to expire. Ranni would no longer have the desire to become the new queen of the coming age, and instead would be content with simply being free from her Empyrean flesh, to prevent her from being a pawn of the Two Fingers. However, you, the Tarnished who would be Lord, would eventually slay the Star Scourge, and the stars would once again command the fate of the descendants of the astrologers. But it seems like fate isn't an all-powerful, determined thing when pit against the Elden Ring and the Grace of Gold. As mentioned earlier, we're going into pure speculation theory now. Now, the Elden Ring commanded the stars themselves. We've heard it before.
That which commanded the stars.
And so the power of the Elden Ring, and by extension the Greater Will and Queen Marika, due to the Elden Beast being the Elden Ring itself, and Queen Marika being the vessel of the Elden Ring, could supersede fate. And those she gave the Grace of Gold to would be able to defy the fate that is written in the stars. Take, for example, the Roundtable and the other Tarnished in the Lands Between. According to Corrin, almost all of them had lost their grace, hence they could no longer go against fate and the will of the outer gods, specifically maybe even the Greater Will. As even though they've been in the Lands Between for some time, they didn't get any closer to the Elden Ring at all, even though they were trying to become the next Elden Lord. Either way, the power of the stars and that of fate have no sway over your decisions, and you stand above even the stars in choosing the coming age. One could argue you're being guided by grace, but to me, this seems more like grace is giving you the ability to supersede fate. In game, it's basically giving you the ability to respawn and be able to change fate by challenging the bosses over and over until you win. However, should you adhere to fate and the stars, it is only by your choice that you can further Ranni's fate, and by Ranni's fate, also the fate of the Lands Between, and the agenda of the stars. A fate that she no longer expected to come true, which is to elevate her to become queen. But if you choose to do so, you can surrender yourself to the stars and adhere to that fate and usher in the Age of the Stars, which in my opinion, this was a fate that should no longer have come true because Ranni already had given up becoming the next queen. But because of your decisions and your ability to supersede fate, you gave it back to her and you became the Lord of the Night, and she became the new queen of the Age of the Stars. Now, why am I even talking about this, and what does it matter if grace supersedes the influence of the stars? Well, as I mentioned at the start of the video, it is speculated that the stars represent the outer gods and their influence in the Lands Between, which is fate. For now, there isn't really much to this theory, but this is actually part of the theory I'm working on for Queen Marika and basically her grand design, something I alluded to many times in my previous videos, and I'm sure many have speculated on already. The fact that Queen Marika planned the downfall of the Greater Will. And I believe how or what the Grace of Gold does is one of the key parts to her plan. But for now, I'll stop there. What do you guys think though? Do you think grace and fate are something similar? Do you think the stars truly control the fate of the beings of the Lands Between? Do you think that Radahn freed the people from the influence of the stars by holding all the stars in place? Do you think that Queen Marika planned it all? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it as it really helps with the algorithm and the channel. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing if you like the content. And as always, thank you for watching.